One of the first things you have to do with multi-cloud defense is actually tell us a little bit about your cloud service providers. So we go through what we call an onboarding process, regardless if you're using AWS, Azure, OCI, through Oracle or even Google Cloud. Now the process differs slightly. So in this video, we're actually going to talk about how to properly onboard Amazon's AWS, specifically using the CloudFormation template. So join us as we move through the process of using the SaaS controller's automated workflows to onboard AWS into multi-cloud defense. So now we're going to go into the onboarding of multi-cloud defense and specifically around AWS. So what you'll see is I currently have a completely empty AWS account that I set up specifically for the purposes of this demo. I'm going to pivot back into multi-cloud defense and launch the CloudFormation template that is part of our onboarding wizard. You'll notice it does launch directly into that account that I had open in the other tab. And what I like to highlight to a lot of customers is that you can actually pull down the exact YAML file that this CloudFormation template is comprised of. We'll just download it now. I'll kind of show you that you can look into it, see the different permissions that it's going to provision. It is possible to modify this, and we do have some kind of like discovery only templates that we could also use, but by default, these are going to be the permissions that are assigned to the 3 roles that we'll be provisioning as part of this CloudFormation deployment within AWS. Now, the stack name, you can name this whatever you want. Typically, if we onboard the same account in multiple multi-cloud defense controllers, you give them different names so that the stack name is a little bit different. Otherwise, you'll get griped at. This prod name, you don't want to change this. This actually correlates. If you look at the actual URL of the multi-cloud defense controller, that actually correlates back to that prod 1 within that URL. This is also the multi-cloud defense account number, so you don't want to change that. And then this external ID is going to be what we leverage within the controller account to kind of specifically bind this to your multi-cloud defense tenant. This prefix name is modifiable. You can basically type in whatever you want. I do recommend leaving Cisco MCD in there, but what you'll see is it's the prefix used for the 3 roles that we'll actually provision within there. We will have an S3 bucket being deployed. Now, by default, it's going to install a new CloudTrail so that we can listen for specific events related to inventory and object creation. I would recommend leaving that to true unless you already have a CloudTrail within your account that we can leverage. So it is going to go through and start to deploy this. I'm going to speed this up, but essentially, once this finishes, we should be able to go in and look at the Outputs tab, which will contain all the information we need to kind of complete the onboarding of AWS into our multi-cloud defense tenant. So we'll speed this up just a little bit, and now we should be done. And we are. So what I'll do is I'll grab the outputs, and don't worry, I'm going to close this account well before these videos ever get published, but we'll grab this information and we'll kind of just paste it in one by one, starting with the account number. And this is the normal flow. This is what I do, for most customers as we set up in production or for POVs. The account name is going to be arbitrary. You cannot use any spaces within here, so just be cognizant of that if you're trying to hit the space bar. We'll call this the AWS demo account. I won't do a description, but you can put a vague description in there of what account it is. The controller IAM role, that is going to tie. If you look at the naming of this, controller IAM is actually the ARN. So just go ahead and pull down that MCD controller ARN. We'll copy it in. And then we will do the same thing with the inventory role. And this should complete the onboarding. It'll kind of go through a little validation step here after we click next. And then you'll see, depending on the size of your account and how much inventory is in the time that this possibly will take might vary a little bit. This being an empty account, it completes pretty quickly, same as the discovery of those underlying assets within that account. So we can successfully say that we have onboarded this account, but we do want to go in and validate that. So I'm going to close out of this, and I'm going to pivot up at the top here to manage, and under cloud accounts, we'll go to inventory. There we go. So notice all the metadata, the inventory objects that we're picking up now. We'll kind of look at VPCs and VNets. We have 17. So we actually subscribe to CloudTrail for events. So because of this, in addition to our periodic polling, if we were to go in and configure something like a new VPC, we should almost in real time see that number increment to 18, unless somebody removes one while we're doing it, but I know that's not possible right now. So I'll just create one called testing inventory VPC. We'll give it a fake CIDR, and we'll submit it. And what we should be able to kind of validate is that that number increments from 17 to 18 VPCs, and we should be able to see that VPC within there. So we'll pivot back to Multicloud Defense and hit refresh here. Notice the VPC VNets does increment to 18. Again, this is because we kind of subscribe to these pub sub buses of these different providers. And if we're looking down through this list, let's refresh it one more time. Maybe. Oh, I only had 15. Yeah, let's click on page 2. And yeah, we see the testing inventory VPC listed here. So again, we know we've kind of successfully onboarded. The inventory piece is at least working. So let's take a look at the AWS account within Multicloud Defense. One thing you may want to do is manage your inventory. Depending on the wizard or the procedure that you use to onboard these, it's going to possibly just enable inventory for every region. Now, if you're not in every region, you may see some errors because of this, because maybe some organizational policy that you guys have in place is not allowing you to use specific regions. So what I like to do is just limit it to the regions that we have inventory assets in. So we change that up here. Now, within AWS, it's sometimes fun to kind of look and see what happened on the AWS side. So I'll kind of pivot over to AWS console and specifically the IAM roles section. And you can see the 3 different roles that were provisioned: the controller role, the gateway role, and the inventory role. Now, if you look into these, each is going to have a applied section of policy that is a little bit different. One thing I will note here is you can look in the onboard documentation, and there is a connecting AWS portion of this where it does go into a little bit of detail around the permissions applied to those roles, why those 3 roles exist. Again, the controller role is just going to be used from the SaaS controller accessing the AWS API. The gateway role is going to be for anything, permissions-wise attached to the Multicloud Defense gateways, which are also the firewall devices. And then the inventory role is what we're using for, of course, inventory-based purposes. We also provision an S3 bucket. Again, we do try to minimize the costs associated with these things. So the S3 bucket, when you start to look through the properties and the different management properties of these, you're going to notice things like it's only got a day of retention, so everything's deleted after a day because the controller should be pulling those out as they're hit within that bucket. And then the permissions are fairly locked down in terms of what has the capability to pull from the bucket and put objects into that bucket. So we'll kind of just scroll slowly here and show the different permissions of this S3 bucket. The last thing we'll look at is the CloudTrail. This CloudTrail, again, is provisioned as part of that onboarding process. And again, it's just a very simple trail where we're looking at those different management-based events or the API events. And again, that's so we can do this kind of inventory tracking in almost real time. It allows us to create, firewall resources like object groups or what we call addresses, and we can populate them using this metadata that we pull in from these various cloud providers. Very, very strong in terms of like dynamic based policy, but all of that's driven through these pub sub mechanisms, which are of course different between the various CSPs. But within AWS, it is using CloudTrail. I also really quickly wanted to touch on the documentation around this. So we have a couple sections within the user guide. So if you kind of look in Multicloud Defense, there's a little question mark in the top right-hand corner. If you go directly to the documentation, it'll pivot you essentially to this page. Now, there are a couple places where we talk about onboarding these accounts. So if you look under the Multicloud Defense user guide, you'll see the setting up the Multicloud Defense with the wizard. There is a Connect Cloud account. If you click on AWS, this is mainly talking about the cloud formation template approach. If you want a little bit more detail, I recommend pivoting out of that and going into the account onboarding section. And if you click on AWS, everything under here is going to be a little bit more detailed than what you found earlier. And what I find particularly intriguing is they do provide, hey, if you were wanting to do all of this manually, here are kind of the overview of the steps we go through in the cloud formation template. And we do get a lot of questions about, hey, what are you guys kind of doing under the hood with this cloud formation template? What's actually happening? And we walk through those roles that we create down here. So there's 3 roles essentially, like I talked about earlier: the controller role, the gateway role. This is actually like a firewall role. It's attached to the virtual machine or EC2 instances that we deploy. And then the inventory role. We actually show all of the different permissions associated with these within here. What I like to highlight though is with regards to like the gateway role, what we're giving them permissions to do is really just from an S3 perspective, putting and listing things in. This is if we're, doing any sort of logging, and as well as like the KMS. So if we are wanting to pull certificates at a later stage out of like an Amazon KMS store, this is where those gateways actually have the permissions to do so. Lastly are the inventory roles. These are really, again, just so that we can dynamically pull that inventory out of your AWS accounts. So the metadata that we can use later in terms of policy, and that we can subscribe to CloudTrail so that we can get those, those updates, those move, add, change, and deletions kind of in real time by getting notifications from the provider. This is where all of that kind of comes together, and Amazon's actually able to notify us if any changes have been made, and we're able to pull down those changes. So this again is the inventory page. If you need to go to it, great. If you never need to because you're just using the wizard and you're able to fly through that without any problems, that's also great. As always, if you found this video useful, keep a keen eye on this channel, as we will be releasing more and more content around the deployment and uses of multi-cloud defense and how you can use it to protect your cloud infrastructure. Thank you for watching. We look forward to seeing you in the next video.